Why hello you lovely little peppercorns, my name's Noa Lee, god of game criticism and lord of excellent taste, and Cryptmaster is a dungeon crawling typing RPG from indie developers Paul Hart and Lee Williams, and is simultaneously the most interesting typing game I've ever played, while also kind of being one of the biggest letdowns of the year. Oh boy, here I go rustling people's jimmies again! As far as typing games are concerned, there's not really a lot to go around, with most of these games falling into the camp of either slapdash web games or edutainment titles licensed to educational systems and schools all around the globe. Indeed, those two camps are where I first came into contact with the concept of a typing game, with titles like Learn to Type 3 forming the backbone of my typist education, and many a random flash game rounding out my skills, as typing games were one of the few genres that could be played on school computers without the teacher or study hall aides having an absolute meltdown. So to me, and I imagine many others who went through middle and high school in the early 2000s, the genre was only ever seen as an educational device meant to trick kids into learning an actual skill through this burgeoning medium called video games. And you know what? It worked, as playing games like this is how I first learned to type, despite my school also forcing us through a whole typing course, which I got absolutely nothing out of other than access to said games. And looking back on my K-12 schooling years, touch typing was probably the only useful thing I ever actually learned. What? Video games having a greater influence on a child's intellectual development than the American public education system? Perish the thought. Anyway, as I grew older, I left typing games behind, partially because I was a console gamer and didn't have a decent computer until I was basically an adult, combined with the fact that the games on offer by my school and Flash websites never really got any better, never really innovating or pushing the genre forward, stagnating as edutainment and web games so often do. That is, until I graduated and started hanging around the old Screw Attack forums and was stunned to learn about a game released in both arcades and on the Sega Dreamcast called Typing of the Dead. I was, at this point, quite familiar with the light gun rail shooter series called House of the Dead, but I had no idea that those cheeky bastards at Sega had modified the second entry in that series into a typing game that many, myself included, consider to be even better than the original. After having played both that and the freshly released House of the Dead Overkill, as well as Screw Attack and Controlled Chaos Media's now mostly lost parody mobile game Texting of the Bread, I sort of went on a bit of a jag to try and find more interesting typing games to play, but alas, I found basically none, and in the 15 or so years since this journey began, I've uncovered very little. All that's to say that when I stumbled upon Cryptmaster just a few weeks ago, you bet your ass I was all over it, playing it immediately upon release, and for the first couple of hours found myself with a gigantic grin plastered on my stupid face as I played because, at least in the early moments, this game is a hell of a lot of fun, and it really injects some much needed life into what is essentially a dead genre at this point. You play as four legendary heroes by the names of Joro, Sin, Maz, and Nyx, who have been awakened hundreds of years after your sacrificial deaths by an ancient necromancer who calls himself the Cryptmaster. Led by this mysterious spirit, the four of you are now tasked with crawling your way out of your crypt and through the larger underworld to reach the surface and the very city you once gave your lives to defend by using the power of letters, typing, and dungeon crawling, a combination that can seem a bit strange upon a first glance, but one that works out surprisingly well, or at least it should. More on that in a bit. Like typing games, dungeon crawlers hail from the earliest days of PC gaming, and indeed educational institutions, with titles like Akalabeth, World of Doom, Rogue, and Dungeons of Daggeroth laying the foundation for the style and mechanics found in many 1980s computer role-playing games, but as the years went on, this genre that was once ubiquitous in the home computing scene became more and more niche as platformers, strategy games, open-world RPGs, and first-person shooters began to dominate the market and alter the tastes and expectations of players. And while this genre still had a decent following in Japan throughout the 90s and early 2000s, in no small part to Atlus's Shin Megami Tensei series, in the West, dungeon crawlers were practically non-existent during this time, relegated to bargain bins in the decrepit corners of software departments that only the most diehard fans and niche PC gamers dared to tread. However, this all sort of changed by the 2010s through a combination of the retro revival scene and retro game reviewers and Let's Players casting new light upon the dungeon crawlers of the past, as well as the rise in popularity in both the West and especially in Japan of games like the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series and Atlus's Etrian Odyssey, which just so happens to be my personal favorite series in the genre. And while dungeon crawlers are still far from being a mainstream genre, they have been going through a bit of a revival as of late, thanks to the popularity of related genres like roguelikes and JRPGs, both of which have increasingly implemented dungeon crawling mechanics as the years have gone on, especially in the indie scene, while modern distribution services like Steam now have a plethora of more old-school dungeon crawlers available to play as well. What excites me most about the genre at the moment is is the willingness in which developers have to merely use the dungeon crawler as a jumping off point for experimentation, rather than simply trying to recapture the magic of the past as so many retro-inspired platformers and classic FPSs attempt to do. And Cryptmaster is one such game that isn't afraid to take this leap. In typical dungeon crawling fashion, the game is presented in a first-person perspective, with you able to move forward and back, as well as turn left and right using the arrow keys on your keyboard, though the absence of the ability to strafe left and right is sorely missed. However, unlike most classic dungeon crawlers, the game forgoes the usual RPG mechanics of levels, hit points, equipment management, experience, and stats in favor of a completely unique system revolving around the use of letters. For even though you play as a group of legendary heroes, your time spent in the grave has muddled your memory as well as your speech, and your journey to the surface acts merely as backdrop for the inner quest to recall your past, your personality, as well as your combat abilities. And you do this by finding letters out in the wild and using them to fill in the blanks of words you're currently trying to recall and make inferences based on which letters you already have in your queue in a sort of Wheel of Fortune Wordle type fashion, with you able to simply spell out the solution at any time should you figure it out. This letter collection system takes the place of the previously mentioned RPG mechanics, while combat is conducted not by selecting attacks and skills from a list, but rather by typing out the name of the ability you'd like to execute, with the game automatically selecting which character in your party is acting based on which skill you happen to type. It's a simple system that has a lot more depth and subtlety to it than a first glance would reveal, as instead of health, both you and the enemy have only the letters of your names to defend yourselves, with an attack removing one or more of these letters and characters dying once all their letters have been removed. Instead of gaining experience points from defeating your foes, you instead choose one letter from their name, which will be added to the previously mentioned queued words that, once solved, can be utilized in combat. In lieu of equipping weapons and tools found in chests, you instead play a sort of 20-question style minigame where you try to remember the name of some random object by asking the Cryptmaster to interact with it in a variety of ways to gain more information that can clue you in on what the item is, with the letters found in the object's name also being added to your queued words should you guess correctly. You can also gain letters through other mini-games such as fishing or solving the riddle of one of the many skull totems found throughout the game. And these sets of mechanics and how they work with the word recall system are the sole means by which you grow in strength as the game progresses, with you even gaining a level and more letters to add to your name, i.e. your health bar, after solving a set number of words. Yet the developers were smart enough to take all these word games a bit further than all of this, with locked doors in which you have to solve a 4-letter combination based on a subtle hint provided by the Cryptmaster, letter substitution ciphers that require careful reading and a bit of research and probably a pen and paper in order to solve, as well as a mana system for certain attacks and abilities that are recharged by typing the names of bugs and fish found throughout the dungeon, or by playing a game called Whatever against other characters in a sort of Magic the Gathering meets Scrabble minigame. Likewise, combat can be a bit more nuanced than simply spelling out the attack you wish to use. Some enemies will have special stipulations that need to be taken into account when fighting them, such as these slime cubes, which will grow in strength if you use a specific letter, armored enemies that require you to use a special ability to break the armor spaces in their name before you can continue dealing damage to them, and even shields and enemies that block the use of certain letters, while some bosses will force you to use your combat abilities to add letters to their recall bar and guess which word needs to be recited in order to dispatch them. All this is very well done and provides some excellent twists on these classic word games that, in theory, meshes perfectly with both a typing game and a dungeon crawler, as well as a medieval fantasy setting such as this. Graphically, the game isn't really anything special, but its heavily stylized monochrome aesthetic really sets a mood that perfectly complements the dreary but humorous setting it all takes place in, reminding me a great deal of Mad World by Platinum Games in both style and tone. I like it. However, the star of the show is, by far, the titular Cryptmaster, whose myriad of vocal lines delivered by Lee Williams' astounding vocal performance is what really sells it all, as this character and how he interacts with the world, as well as your 4 party members, is just a treat, while the sheer lengths the game goes to when it comes to listening for and responding to almost anything the player types in is truly a sight to behold. You come for the interesting mix of word games, typing challenges, and dungeon crawling, you stay for the charming witticisms and vocal performance of the Cryptmaster. Add into this some decent background music that isn't afraid to remain low-key and melt into the greater mise-en-scène, and some excellent sound effects to tie it all together, and at least on a surface level, the game seems to be a resounding success. However, excellent aspects taken individually don't necessarily add up to an excellent game when taken as a whole, and unfortunately, Cryptmaster isn't quite able to stitch all of its unique ideas together into a meaningful experience, ending up as one of those games that's more interesting for the potential it has rather than for what it actually is. To begin with, the combination of typing and dungeon crawling mechanics is certainly a neat one, but this is hardly the first game to piece those two concepts together, nor is it the most successful, as games like Backspace Boken beat it to the punch by nearly 5 years, while a quick search on itch.io leads to plenty of game jam titles like The Spelling Dungeon, 3 Verses, and Spell that combined cover almost all of the interesting ideas that Cryptmaster has on offer, while the remaining are simply twists on word games that have been around for centuries and indeed present in a multitude of other games. What Cryptmaster, in theory, should have going for it is taking all these ideas and piecing them together in new and interesting ways, and in some regards it does just that, but these ideas are only loosely connected as a whole work of art, while the developers clearly spent the vast majority of their time on the game's presentation and word games, while sadly providing only the most basic dungeon crawling experience to tie it all together. And that right there might be the biggest flaw with this game, that the dungeon crawling just kinda sucks, and each moment in between combat encounters, riddles, chests, and character interactions is little more than tedious filler, as there really isn't any incentive for exploration outside of progressing the main quest, yet the dungeon is designed as though it should be filled to the brim with secrets, nooks and crannies full of goodies, and special interactions and side quests galore, but really there's none of that save for one side quest to find a lost rat child early in the game, and several secret fishing holes because for some reason the developers think that fishing is all players want to be rewarded with for their exploration efforts. Yeah, no thanks. Honestly, I'm not really sure why they decided to go with this style of dungeon crawling at all, as it doesn't seem like the developers were all that interested in the genre or understood what would be sacrificed by stripping away the RPG mechanics and equipment systems these games normally have, as those two things provide much of the impetus for exploration in this kind of game. Exploration is a key component of the genre, so to design a game that doesn't really focus on that, and in some respects actively discourages it, is more than a little disappointing. To me, the core of the game, the combat and the word puzzles, would have fit much better into a side-scrolling dungeon crawler like Darkest Dungeon. That way you could still have all of your word puzzles and letter-based progression system without all the unnecessary fluff that currently makes up the bulk of the game. This all becomes even more problematic due to the fact that the combat never really evolves as the game progresses, and even though it attempts to throw you for a loop with the aforementioned curveballs of blocking letters and armored foes, as well as increasing the length of an enemy's name and how much damage they do in a single hit, quickly gets repetitive to the point that each combat encounter becomes more of a chore rather than an interesting interaction, which further disincentivizes the player from wanting to explore, as doing so only increases the likelihood you'll find yourself in another tiresome fight. In addition, there are also a few accessibility options and difficulty considerations that probably ate up much of the developer's time that may have been better served shoring up and balancing the core dungeon crawling experience. These accessibility options allow you to tweak the game to your liking, such as by allowing the Cryptmaster to solve riddles for you, giving you more attempts at guessing what's in the chests, as well as having the game slowly fill in a letter of the object's name to make guessing easier, while the game also has a turn-based mode available for those who aren't the best typists or simply want a more laid-back experience, and even a vocal recognition mode for those who may be unable to or simply have trouble typing, and that's all great to see. However, based on how poorly balanced this game is, I'm not really sure if most of these accessibility and difficulty options were even necessary, as even with all the default hints turned off, Cryptmaster is so woefully unbalanced in the player's favor that it can get pretty boring pretty quickly, despite also having a few moments that will utterly destroy you if you don't know what you're getting into. I'm not sure if the developers simply underestimated the ability of the average gamer, or if they just got hung up on the fact that because this is a game all about word puzzles and typing, that they really needed to focus on it being accessible for neurodivergent players, especially those who are dyslexic or have trouble reading and spelling, but either way, something got messed up during development, and in my estimation, that something has put a pretty big damper on the whole experience. Now, I'm dyslexic, and as such, word games, riddles, puns, and especially spelling have always been really difficult for me, so you'd think I'd be the kind of person who would need, or indeed want, to utilize some of the previously mentioned accessibility and difficulty options, yet due to how poorly balanced everything is, I never felt the need, never felt like I was at a disadvantage at all. Quite the opposite, in fact, as I destroyed this game despite practically falling asleep on more than one occasion because of how dull it can get when you're actually forced to do some dungeon crawling rather than just interacting with the word games. And this is despite me solving less than half of my party's queued ability words and only actually leveling up a single time, as well as only correctly guessing around half of the chests and solving a paltry quarter of the riddle skulls yet in each and every combat encounter I succeeded without hardly any difficulty other than trying to stay awake. Add on top of that the fact that my dyslexia also extends to me flipping letters around while writing or typing, such as how I often typed Sin's jab ability as Jap, despite the two letters being half a keyboard, 3 rows, and 4 fingers away from each other, because in my head P and B are just the same damn letter in a different orientation, and you'd think I would have really struggled to finish this game. And actually, I did really struggle to finish this game, but not because it was difficult, but rather because after the first few hours, I was so bored to tears that I had to practically force myself to see it through to the end, an ending which just sort of happens, by the way, as the developers clearly don't have a strong grasp on storytelling and how to wrap everything up with a neat bow, so the game just sort of gets to a certain point and stops. Occasionally, though, the game's improper balancing will actually make things harder, temporarily, as on more than one occasion I came across one of those enemies that blocks a certain letter while also wearing armor, and the only ability I had at the time which could break armor just so happened to contain the one letter he was immune to, so I basically just had to sit there and wait for him to finish me off because there was literally nothing I could do. Then there's the fact that there just aren't enough variations or number of word puzzles to fill a game as long as this one, so finding chests and solving riddles, combat encounters, and fishing all end up getting really repetitive really quickly, and I found myself hoping, in vain, that the game would introduce new and interesting twists on other classic word games like a literal version of Hangman or a super secret area that could only be unlocked by solving a crossword puzzle or something like that, but as is, it's just the same handful of mechanics played out over and over again. Which is a shame, as this excellent setup and payoff that the game so expertly crafts in the opening moments of the game never really get the chance to evolve to the point where you want to spend more than just a few hours with them, and judging by the fact that only around 10% of players have even finished this game, despite how easy it can be, that seems to be the case, with Cryptmaster long overstaying its welcome and relying far too much on the scenario, quirky characters, and situations, as well as the vocal performances, to hopefully keep the audience invested. Tedium and repetition is a trap that many dungeon crawlers have fallen into in the past, but it's one that's exacerbated here due to the game's unique leveling system. In a more traditional dungeon crawling RPG, moments of downtime and torpor are counteracted somewhat by the feeling of constantly growing in power and the desire to see what can be found in the deeper depths of the dungeon, as well as the fact that the more you explore, the more likely you are to find better gear and gain some much needed levels and abilities. But since Cryptmaster has stripped all of this away and replaced it with its Wheel of Fortune style word recall system that's largely based on guessing, trial and error, and sheer dumb luck, I found myself going long stretches of time where I wasn't getting the letters I needed and couldn't figure out the words in my queue, yet I was still defeating hordes of enemies, solving a handful of chests and riddles, and catching more fish and bugs than I care to admit, just so I would have some level of interaction to keep myself from nodding off while I walked the same handful of rooms over and over again, desperately trying to find that lost rat child or the paladin's helmet, or even just gain enough information and insight that I could realistically figure out the incredibly difficult cipher riddles that, once solved, would allow me to transport myself to a new area and continue on with the main quest. Of course, most of this wouldn't be a problem if the game continued to build upon its mechanics and find new and creative ways to incorporate variations on the ways in which you collect letters, solve puzzles and riddles, and humor you with its punny interactions while weaving it all into its larger design, but by the time you get to the bone houses, what is ostensibly the second level of the game, it's already played its entire hand, and from that point onward has little more to offer save for more enjoyably offbeat interactions with the titular Cryptmaster. And that right there might be the one saving grace of this game. The Cryptmaster is a very endearing and funny character who steals the show every moment he's speaking or popping up on screen, which, to the game's credit, is quite frequently, and it's during these moments when the game truly shines. Because the Cryptmaster has a lot to say, and he plays off of the player's inputs to a much deeper level than you would expect, to the point that even if you try to throw him for a loop by asking him to do something out of left field, like eat an item from a chest that he just said looked like it wanted to bite him, or spelling out a naughty word that you think would just be ignored by the developers, he pops up and surprises you with a witty interaction and humorous jab aimed directly back at the player to a degree that's almost uncomfortable, and it's amazing how well the developers predicted what people were going to type into their game. Each moment when you find a chest and are trying to guess an item inside to obtain some precious letters to add to your word bars is a joy to behold, as are the moments when he chastises you for wandering around aimlessly or for falling into an obvious trap. The problem, of course, is that these moments, while charming, aren't really enough to carry the game and come across more as a reprieve from the tedium of the exploration and combat, rather than the cherry on top of some already excellent gameplay, as they should, combined with the fact that these moments are little more than fancy cutscenes that you don't even need to play the game yourself in order to enjoy, as watching a friend or streamer's playthrough would be more than sufficient. Much of this problem is exacerbated by the fact that level design just isn't something that the developers are all that good at, as almost all of it ranges from incredibly straightforward and lifeless to downright labyrinthine and frustrating, with very few landmarks to help orient yourself, and room design that's so generic that rarely can you tell one portion of the minimap from another, let alone how each section fits together. This is true of a lot of other dungeon crawlers, to be sure, but again, the absence of traditional incentives for exploration and the lack of an overarching floor map to maintain your bearings really makes just moving about this world a lot more tedious and frustrating than it needs to be. And the graphics, while decent and enjoyably stylized, don't help much in this regard either, as their monochrome color scheme and simple textures further makes everything a confusing mashup of sameness that makes it all too easy to forget where you are in relation to quest givers, safe zones, or places you haven't yet explored. When stripped down to its bare core, this is the kind of game that would have been much better had it only been 3 or 4 hours long, not 12 to 15, because as is, that's about all the mechanics and scope of the game can truly cover. The rest is just filler, and not particularly good filler at that, at least as far as the gameplay is concerned, which leaves me with the sense that this game just isn't finished and could have used at least another year of development, or otherwise had large swaths of content excised from it in order to make it a much shorter and more streamlined experience. And I might just be onto something with this thought based on an interview with GameDeveloper.com where Lee Williams said once we'd settle on using words for everything, the ideas for mechanics just kept coming. There are just so many fun things to do with words and letters. I'd say we ditched far more ideas than we used. Why? Your game could have used more ideas in mechanics, like far more than you use. I mean, my biggest criticism of this game is ultimately that I don't feel that it goes deep enough with its premise and only ever gives us a tech demo's worth of ideas stretched out to the length of a full game, plastered on top of one of the most basic dungeon crawlers I've ever seen. So to hear that the developers supposedly had a lot more ideas kicking around in their head that they never implemented just adds further credence to my feeling that the game was rushed to market and not given the time it needed to come into its own. I've not a doubt in my mind that Cryptmaster took a lot of work and dedication to make, especially since this is Paul and Lee's first game, or at least I think it's their first game, but I also can't deny that this game also reeks of the amateurish outlook on what a video game should even be, and that the focus was more on the bells and whistles than on the core that matters. Presentation-wise, I've no complaints. Sound-wise, I've no complaints. Voice acting, premise, basic combat mechanics, puzzles, and world building, I've no complaints. But when it comes to its dungeon crawling, its progression, its variety, and the overall structure of the game, the very core of what needed the most attention, it all feels like an afterthought, an interesting first draft that needed 2 or 3 more passes. Having a game that has a dictionary's worth of vocal lines and responses to player input is a neat trick, and I know damn well that must have taken ages to craft, but I'm not convinced it was all that necessary or that it makes the game any more impactful. Obviously, the developers couldn't account for everything the player might enter in, or indeed want to respond to everything the player might type out, like a particularly offensive word such as a sexual act or a racial slur, and in these cases, the Cryptmaster just flat out ignores you, and rightfully so, and you know what? It doesn't affect the game in the slightest. And if that's the case, the extra busy work the developers made for themselves by having the game listen for and respond to as wide variety of words as possible might just have been one of those procrastinatory creators traps that are so easy to fall into, where you think you're making progress on your work of art, but really you're just deceiving yourself by tackling tedious tasks that only ever add up to superficial additions to your work. This is another one of those games that I'm probably going to piss off a lot of people with my overall take and criticisms, as at the time of writing, the game is currently sitting at an overwhelmingly positive rating on Steam, while the developers have received mountains of praise and stellar reviews and even awards for the design of their game. But I'm sorry, if I can better experience everything that's special about this game by watching a playthrough of it on YouTube and skipping past all of its drudgery rather than sitting down and playing it for myself, then the game is a failure as a work of art within the medium of video games, and I'm not going to shy away from calling the developers out for that fact. That said, there is a lot to enjoy about Cryptmaster, and I'm not saying anyone's wrong for liking it. Hell, I still like it, even though I don't think it's a very good game at the end of the day, but this is also one of those projects where it just feels like the developers didn't trust the artistic process to follow their muse and dig deep with what the project meant to them on a personal, subconscious level, instead getting hung up on aspects they logically thought would appeal to the masses, rather than working from the heart, creating for themselves first and foremost, and then sharing a piece of their soul with the world. And judging by the reaction that this game has gotten so far, I guess they succeeded. But I can still see plenty of love and dedication in this project as well, but all of that love and dedication seem to be aimed solely at the presentation, the bells and whistles, and the developers just didn't seem to have the ambition to take the project as far as it needed to go and expand upon the ideas and mechanics they came up with, nor the self-awareness necessary to reduce the game's scope down to the level of the interesting tech demo it actually is, causing it all to exist in this sort of limbo state where it tries to stretch what few mechanics it has out way too far while also being too timid to dig deeper and explore a few more. Paul Hart and Lee Williams clearly aren't without talent, but their talents seem like they may be better served in other mediums or part of a larger game design team acting as support for someone else's vision, because ultimately this is a project that feels like it was made by a couple of guys who don't seem like they really understand what makes video games different from other artistic mediums, or simply don't care, and because of that, their work can only be appreciated on the most shallow of surface levels. That said, I hope I'm wrong on that, and that Paul and Lee will give it another go with a sequel or a spiritual successor of some kind and implement some of those ideas that they supposedly left out the first time around, because with a little more care, a lot more dedication to shoring up the core gameplay, less focus on the presentation, bells and whistles, and a much greater trust in the artistic process, they could potentially make me eat my words one day, and I hope they manage to do just that. I'm Noa Lee, god of game criticism, and thus have I spoken.